It's been a year now since Sandy's mother passed away. Sandy couldn't hold back her tears when she found out that her mother had left this anklet to her daughter. It was the most beautiful thing she could ever get from her, and vowed never to get rid of it. But times are not so good for Sandy due to financial distress. Now she has to sell the anklet, or they won't be able to eat this month. When Sandy goes to a jeweler with the ankle bracelet, he tells her this. As soon as the appraiser laid his eyes on Sandy's anklet, his demeanor changed. He started asking a lot of questions about it, and he was curious to know where she got it from. He suddenly grabbed it and went into a back room, leaving Sandy surprised and alone in the store. It was past opening hours, so the store was closed and she had nowhere to go. She overheard the appraiser talking on the phone, and when she heard what he thought the bracelet was made of, she gasped. She wanted to go into the room to take back her bracelet, but the door was locked. She knew she needed to call the police immediately. But why did Sandy call the police? What was the anklet made of? And why was the appraiser acting so strangely? But before we start, smash the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Just before Sandy's due date, her mother passed away. It truly broke her heart because her mother had been so excited about meeting her granddaughter, and now she left before ever getting the chance to do so. Sandy spent weeks in bed, not eating or sleeping. Sandy was able to enjoy her final week of being pregnant with her husband Greg by her side. He had been very supportive of her this whole journey, and even a little bit more after the passing of her mother. Finally, it was time for her daughter to be born. Luckily, everything went smoothly and Sandy was in and out of the hospital within a day. On their way home, she looked into the back view mirror and saw their little nugget asleep in her car seat. Sandy frowned at her husband, as she wasn't expecting any visitors or packages. He walked over to the door where a security screen hung and saw a man in a suit standing outside. "Can I help you?" he asked through the intercom. "I have something for Miss Hunterberg." It's from her mother Sandy, who could hear the conversation from the couch, jumped up. She walked toward her husband as fast as she could, who looked at her with worry in return. Sandy stared at the little black box and the letter that lay next to it. "Should I read it?" she asked Greg. "Of course," Greg said, clearly surprised by her question. "Why shouldn't you read it?" Sandy shrugged her shoulders. Then, she grabbed the letter and began to read. "My dear daughter, I'm so sorry I'm not here to get to know your daughter. I can feel my battle with this awful disease is almost over, and I'm trying my best to hold on long enough. But if I fail, then this letter will reach you through my driver." Sandy put the letter down on the table and opened the box. Inside was a beautiful golden-like anklet. Sandy gasped as she took it out of the box, and she couldn't hold in her emotions any longer. As soon as her daughter woke up, she put the little anklet on, and since then, she wore it every day. Since then, every time Sandy looked at the little anklet around her daughter's ankle, she smiled. But things weren't always happy. When Anna was around 6 months, Greg lost his job. Things began to change in their household as they had to adjust to a life without a lot of money. Feeding Anna had been their #1 priority, even if that meant not eating themselves. Greg spent every day trying to find a job, and Sandy could see it was taking a toll on his mood and mental health. She had kept the little box it came in, so Sandy placed the anklet back in its box and put it in her purse. As soon as Greg would come home, she would go to the jeweler to get the anklet appraised. After 2 hours, her husband finally came home and took over the duty of caring for their daughter. Sandy quickly walked to the closest jewelry store. She directly walked over to the counter and asked if an appraiser was present at the store, and there was. A few moments later, the appraiser arrived. The appraiser looked at the anklet with great interest. Sandy stood in silence, waiting patiently for him to say something, but the only sounds the man was making were aha. After about 10 minutes of intensely looking at the anklet, the appraiser suddenly looked up. "I have good news and bad news usually in situations like these." Sandy always chose to hear the good news first. But now that her life depended on it, she decided to hear the bad news first. That way, it could only get better. "Bad news first," she said, her heart pounding in her chest. "Well, it's," the man began, but he got interrupted by a phone call. "Well," Sandy asked as soon as he was done calling. The man thought about something for a second, then looked up at Sandy and simply said, "I'll be right back," before Sandy could say something or take back the anklet. The man disappeared into the back, taking the anklet with him. Sandy stood alone in the store, confused by what had just happened. Many questions raced through Sandy's head, but one thing was sure: she couldn't leave without the anklet. She listened carefully, hoping to eavesdrop on his conversation in the back, but he closed the door behind him. After a few minutes, she heard the man talking in the room all the way to the end of the hallway. She quietly walked over to the door and pressed her ear against it. When she could finally understand what he was talking about, she knew it was bad news. "Can I help you?" a man asked her very loudly. Soon after, the door opened and the appraiser appeared. "What are you doing back here?" he asked Sandy irritatedly. Sandy felt her face getting red. "I have to go," she eventually lied. "So I wanted to ask for my anklet back." The appraiser and the man exchanged looks. "I'm sorry, but that won't be possible," the appraiser said. Sandy's eyes widened in shock. "What?" Why, she asked as she turned her head looking at both men. "I haven't sold you that anklet yet. It's still mine," she said as she tried to barge through the door. "Please wait inside the store. We will explain everything to you when we ourselves know more about it," the man said as he pointed Sandy in the direction of the store. Sandy sighed. She had no choice but to oblige. So Sandy followed the man back into the store while the appraiser went back into the room with the anklet. This time, Sandy wasn't left alone, as the other man stayed with her. "My name is James. I'm the owner of the store," the man said with a slight smile. "Isn't the anklet made out of solid gold?" Sandy asked, not paying attention to what James just said. "I mean, even I can see it is made out of some sort of gold, so what is so important about it?" she said before James could answer. It's a bit more complicated than you think. Yes, the anklet is made out of solid gold, but there is a bit more to it, James said. "This is practically stealing, she said loudly. I came to this jewelry store at the corner of the street, close to my home on 8th Street, to get my anklet appraised and hopefully sell it. But you guys are now almost holding me hostage in this plague." James was clearly confused by her sudden outburst and how she said it, but he had no clue she only did it so the operator on the phone knew where to send the police to. It was possible for the operator to think it was just a butt dial and ignore her call, but she hoped by exaggerating the situation into a hostage situation, they wouldn't be able to ignore it. "You called the police?" James exclaimed, and just as he said that, police sirens could be heard. "Yes, and judging by the sound, they are finally here," Sandy replied. "I can't believe it," James said as he quickly ran through the door into the hallway. "Dan, you have to hurry," he yelled at the appraiser. Andy waited by the door and tried to open it for the police to come in, but the door didn't budge. She realized James must have locked it while she was in the back. She waved at the police, hoping they would see her, and luckily they did. Within seconds, they broke down the door. The police walked out of the hallway with Dan and James handcuffed beside them. "You should be the one in handcuffs," James angrily hissed at Sandy as he walked past her. Occasion after James and Dan were put inside the police car, another officer walked over to Sandy. "Miss, I have to take this back to the station as evidence," he said as he showed her the anklet. Sandy sighed. She had hoped she could take it home. "When will I get it back?" she asked. "We have to interrogate everyone, including you. After that, we will know more," the officer said. Sandy nodded. She followed the officer back to his car and drove with him to the police station. She couldn't believe her little trip to the jewelry store turned into this. Greg must be so worried. Sandy repeatedly said it was a gift from her late mother, but the police didn't seem to believe her. Then, they suddenly said something that confused her. "Did you know what it was when you brought it in?" She asked her. "Why would I get it appraised if I know it's worth?" Sandy responded. Sandy couldn't believe what she was hearing. "What do you mean you have nothing to arrest them for? They kept me hostage in their jewelry store and wouldn't give back my anklet." The police officer let her vent for a second, and when she calmed down, he explained everything to her. Dan acted so suspiciously because he recognized the material of the anklet, not because of the solid gold and its value, but because he had seen it before. Sandy was stunned. How could he have seen the anklet before? Could he have known her mother when she was still alive? Suddenly, Dan stepped forward. "I recognize the anklet as I have one too." "Well, my daughter has one," Sandy frowned. "What are you saying?" she asked Dan. "Well, my mother gave me away when I was a baby, as she was only 16 when she gave birth to me. The only thing I had left from her was that anklet, and her name. Still stunned by what just happened, she began to laugh and gave Dan a hug. They exchanged addresses and phone numbers to keep in touch, and they agreed to do a DNA test to be 100% sure if they really were half-siblings. And as it turned out, Dan couldn't let Sandy sell the anklet, so he decided to lend her some money so they could get their life back on track. With that money, they were able to get through the hard times with enough food, until Greg was able to find a new job. After that, they paid off their debts and were back to their old lives, now with a family member richer.